All right, our featured speaker. Shalom, assalamu alaikum. I'd like to introduce Ambassador Raf Gangat. He is a former South African ambassador to the Palestinian territories, the United Arab Emirates, and Consul General to Pakistan. Mr. Gangat resides in East Jerusalem, or as he terms it, the Holy Land of Conflict. He works as a professional communication and media consultant and currently has a radio talk show which he hosts in Israel. So without ado, let me introduce Mr. Raf Gangat.
Well, thank you, Brian. Ladies and gentlemen, fellow cyber colleagues, good morning to you. To begin with, a very warm hello and special thanks to my good friend, Dr. Brian Polkinghorn at Salisbury University and his wonderful program, of which I was a part of 2 years ago, and for his kind recommendation. Thank you, Brian. Well, I'm both honored and humbled to be able to join you from the land of eternal conflict. From the time of the Romans to the Crusaders, the Turks, the British, the Jordanians, the conflict continues. Today, the protagonists are Israelis and Palestinians. Well, ironically, while divisions widen and conflicts amongst humans on the terrestrial level continue, we are at the same time reaching out and forging ties that bind. Thanks to cyberspace, I was quite pleased to learn that we have universities all across the United States and some from South America as well joining us this evening. Well, on the other hand, when we talk about conflicts, they're so easy to resolve. Take the classic case of two kids fighting over the sharing of a cake. Who cuts the cake? Who chooses? I mean, that's the question. Well, to manage this with a win-win outcome, he that cuts the cake lets the other choose. And this places the onus on the first kid to make sure it's equally cut and the conflict is then resolved to both his satisfaction. Now, focusing as a South African who grew up during the worst days of apartheid, serving as a diplomat during its last days and demise, and then I continued during the glorious Mandela years of peace and reconciliation. Today, 21 years after freedom and democracy, I can simply say the solution to ending apartheid was, in essence, all the players in the conflict, which is about color, race, and culture, sat around a table, spoke to one another, and then we jointly wrote a constitution which addressed everyone's hopes, fears, and aspirations. Well, following that, we had democratic elections, and many more have followed since. Well, I like to quote Nelson Mandela, if you want to make peace with your enemy, you have to work with your enemy, and then he becomes your partner, unquote. Well, coming back to the eternal conflict to the Holy Land, in 2003, as South Africa's ambassador to Palestine, I had a ringside seat on the Palestinian side of the conflict, and I perceived it from that perspective. And let me admit, it was also clouded by my South African experience. In 2008, I made the transition from being an ambassador to become a DJ and the host of the only political talk show on 93.6 RAM FM, a radio station that provided a platform for both Palestinians and Israelis in a neutral language, English. I then entered the ring itself, and in a sense, I became a referee to the conflict. Well, then it was time for me to suspend my own perceptions, engage Israeli society, understand its fears and problems, and also to give a voice to Palestinian society to articulate its hopes and aspirations, all in order to have a comprehensive picture of the conflict and to be an objective facilitator to peaceful dialogue. And hosting guests from both sides and talking about issues that divided them as well as united them, I learned eventually no one wants to hear the truth. As Frantz Fanon aptly said, and I quote him, sometimes people hold a core belief that is very strong. When they are presented with evidence that works against that belief, the new evidence cannot be accepted. It would create a feeling that is extremely uncomfortable, called cognitive dissonance. And because it is so important to protect the core belief, they will rationalize, ignore, and even deny anything that doesn't fit in with the core belief, unquote. Well, today, as a detached observer sitting far away from the ring itself, I can say this conflict is all about the land. One party believes they have a God-given title deed to the land, whereas the other party believes it's their ancestral land. Well, briefly, after the first uprising, or as they call it, the Intifada, managing of the conflict manifested in the Oslo Peace Accords, which gave 78% of the Holy Land to Israel and 22% to Palestine. Yet it did not work. Why, one would ask? Well, security became an issue for the Israelis. Freedom remained the issue for the Palestinians. Well, this conflict has dragged on, and many today consider it intractable. Yet the solution is so simple. If one obtains freedom, the other gets its security. And I mean, if it's not for me to prescribe, a solution to the conflict, but if both sides simply sit down and talk, I'm of the firm conviction that it can be solved. Like what we did in South Africa. We sat down, we addressed our fears, concerns, hopes, and that's where we resolved it. It's the only way to solve this conflict. Otherwise, the longer this conflict continues, the chances of obtaining a peaceful solution is fading away, and quite fast too. While the alternative is fascism on the one side and radicalism on the other side, both explosive ingredients for yet another bloody war. While all said and done, history has taught us many lessons we continue to ignore. And briefly, let me talk about colonialism. Colonialism ushered in European superiority, but eventually came undone, beginning with the philosophy of Mahatma Gandhi, who began his journey in South Africa and played a key role in standing up against the British, obtaining India's freedom and democracy. Hitler's Nazism, based on the notion of the superiority of the Aryan race, produced World War II and the Holocaust. And that led to untold suffering and the deaths of millions, but that was eventually checked by the Allied forces before that cancer spread. Stalin's communism came up against Western capitalism, which then led to a protracted Cold War, eventually caving into freedom and economic enslavement, just like the rest. Well, apartheid, conjured up by white Afrikaner nationalists, caused much grief and harm to millions who suffered under the yoke of an inhumane social system. Well, eventually, Nelson Mandela led the country from that abyss into an era of freedom and reconciliation. But sadly today, xenophobia has filled in that vacuum left by apartheid, and Africans today are fighting and killing fellow South Africans in my country, South Africa. Well, Zionism, based on the notion of the biblical chosen race, has produced two uprisings, an intractable conflict in the Holy Land between Semitic cousins with untold pain, suffering that has no end in sight. American exceptionalism, its overt since 9/11, has produced a never-ending war on terror, with millions dying, maimed, or displaced in the lands that house these elusive terrorists. Colonialism, Nazism, communism, apartheid, Zionism, exceptionalism, call them by whatever name, they all have the same root, where one race or people believe they is superior to another. It is this obsession with us and them that has led all of us into that. Man continues to divide on these unnatural notions, and as we realize that it is in fact sowing the seed to its own destruction by doing so. My own struggle and life's journey has taught me that until this philosophy of one race being superior to another is thrown into the trash can of history, and we embrace our fellow humans as brothers and sisters in this common terrestrial journey, pain, suffering, and wars shall continue. I'd like to conclude with a quote from a song by Pink Floyd, ashes and diamonds, foe and friend, we were all equal in the end. I thank you.